Without further ado, I hope you'll join me in welcoming tonight's guest, Edward Burtynsky. Thanks for coming out. I figured we would begin by defining terms. You are here to talk in large measure about your latest project, which is called Anthropocene. It is two simultaneous exhibitions, one at the National Gallery just down the street and one at the Art Gallery of Ontario. It's a movie, it is 2 books, it is podcasts, it's a floor wax, it's a non-dairy whipped topping. But it begins with that word. What is Anthropocene?
It's a word that was minted at around 2000 by Paul Crutzen, and basically, he had won a Nobel Prize for his work, and he determined that the planet is now shifting into a new epoch, and that we as humans are shifting the human systems more than all natural systems combined in terms of Earth systems. So we as humans are an agency of change into the next epoch, and that's never happened on the planet where one species is the agency of change. So, anthro, man, or human, scene, change. So we're changing it, and the last time we've had an epoch change was 12,000 years ago from the last ice age. And the last time we've had an extinction event to the scale of this one was 65 million years ago, where the dinosaurs went extinct from a meteor impact. So, that bears, paying attention, I believe, because again, it's in front of us, we can see what's happening, and the driver clearly seems to be us.
Okay, so it's essentially about the moment when human history has become the history of the world, when we matter more than everything else that's happening in the world. And one of the things that's intriguing when I watch the film is that it doesn't depict this as unrelievedly a horrible thing. It's an event or a moment that brings with it choices, and that we just have to think about the choices that we can make.
Absolutely. I mean, it doesn't mean that it has to be a bad Anthropocene or we won't survive it. But it does mean that we have to become aware of it, and the raising of a consciousness is what we as artists are trying to do through the film and the exhibitions and the photographs. And that raising of consciousness hopefully contributes to the ongoing dialogue. Obviously, there are many who are telling this story, and we believe as artists we can bring that story forward in a way that allows us to own the issues ourselves. We're not like preaching, we're not also prescriptive, saying if we just do this, it's all going to be okay, but we're kind of revealing what we're doing and not accusing those who are doing it, because we believe we're all implicated in this.
Okay. Before we go much further, I thought we would simply show you a little bit of Edward's work, the work that he did with his collaborators, Nicolas Depensier, Jennifer Baichwal. And we've got a trailer for the movie version of Anthropocene. So I direct your attention to these 2 screens, and we'll take a look at that clip now.
The Anthropocene is the time in the geological record when humans have moved the planet outside its natural limits.
Humans go from being participants in the whole Earth to being a dominant feature.
Dominating the oceans, the landscape, agriculture, animals.
It could be a full-scale catastrophic change. We have not a way to get back. We live now in a different world.
It is such a fundamental change in the way the Earth is behaving that we need to communicate that as powerfully as possible to everybody.
I get goosebumps looking at that. I saw the press screening for the movie at TIFF, the Toronto International Film Festival. And afterwards, my friends asked, well, what's it like? And I said, it's essentially a cinematic tour of every part of the world that looks like an Edward Burtynsky photo. 4 years in the making. And I get the impression you were working kind of full tilt for most of those 4 years on this because you racked up a lot of air miles.
Yeah, and the first year is really kind of forming the idea and where we're going to go. At the same time as we're doing that, in film, they're expensive projects, especially with all the travel and all the equipment we're moving as well. That first year is also fundraising. Well, the fundraising never really stops when you're making a film, but it was, that process of constantly saying, where do we go and what are we trying to say about this place? And in my office in my home, we had this war room with a magnetic wall, and we had all the categories of the Anthropocene Working Group, anthroturbation and techno fossils and terraforming and all the extinction events and all these. And underneath each one of those categories, we were using my older works or sometimes things we found online, things from magazines. We had researchers helping us all the time as well. And then we would kind of plot, where we're going, and what we're trying to say about where we're going.
Okay. You say all of your equipment. What is some of the equipment that you bring with you to capture these images?
Well, even from the very beginning of the project, I started the project with my own Hasselblad camera, and I moved away from film probably in, I think, 2007 is when I started doing a lot of aerial work, and found that the digital back, the Hasselblad, which is a medium format digital back, was a far better tool to do the work from an aircraft, whether it's a fixed wing or a helicopter. And once I discovered that, I kind of shifted away from large formats. So all my work before that was with a hood and an upside down image, like an Ansel Adams type of approach, and it's very slow and methodic, and you need a tripod on the ground. And now I'm in the air, and I'm trying to get the same feeling as if I, made that shot in the same way, contemplating it on a tripod, but now I'm moving around on a helicopter and having to do many, many shots. And so the digital format actually ended up being much better than the film format for approaching that subject from that way of working. And so then I started actually with a 40 megapixel Hasselblad, and then as this technology kept moving, even at the beginning of this project, it was a 60 megapixel, and I thought, this is great. And now I'm working with a 100 megapixel Hasselblad. So it is almost, with this medium format camera, I'm almost working at the quality of what was my 8x10. I'd say it's like a 5x7. So it's better than my 4x5 format, but it's not quite my 8x10, but it's pretty good. And all the images at the National Gallery and the AGO are all shot with that either 60 or 100 megapixel camera. And then we also would travel with drone, and that drone was big enough to carry my Hasselblad. So all in, it's about a 40-pound package. Then, of course, film equipment, and we had VR equipment and special heads for murals. So those murals that you would also see at the show were a special head that stitches a digital picture together using about 120 or 200 images, and then you get this incredible resolution that it's literally billboard size, but you can walk up to it and see every leaf on the plant, and you can see excruciating detail with this new technology, which was impossible 10 years ago or 15 years ago. So I've been in this kind of photographic renaissance where all this new equipment, lens-based equipment, is coming on board. There's virtual reality, augmented reality, and I'm working with those tools as well. And so it's really, when we go there, there's about 6 choices I have of how to approach that subject. Do we do it filmically? Do I do augmented reality? Do we want to do a VR 360 video of this? Do we want stills? Do I want film? Do I want to put the film camera on a drone? Do we do a film camera on a helicopter? So all these are a kind of a menu board that we can now work with. And as we go into different places with different challenges, we then adapt the tools to the ideas that we're trying to express.
So just for comparison's sake, to be briefly a little less technical, I've got a Google Pixel telephone. It's a dynamite phone camera, and it's got a resolution of about 11 megapixels. And so your best digital camera has about 10 times that resolution, 10 times that kind of fine detail. And to allow, and what it allows you to do is to be way more dynamic and to gather way more information on a shoot than when you were just going one frame at a time.
Yeah, and if you look at the Lagos picture, which is on display, so what I was able to do is get the drone, put a wide-angle lens on my Hasselblad 100 megapixel, go out there, find the point of view that I said, okay, it looks really good there. I like that point of view with a wide-angle lens. Bring the drone back, take the wide-angle lens off, put a telephoto lens on, rebalance the whole drone, send it back up there, and with drones today, and this is like, again, that large drone, we can geo-lock it. So we could say, okay, lock it here, and now it's within 6 inches of that position. Even with wind hitting it, it'll stay within a 6-inch window. And then I can use with a telephoto lens, I'm starting to shoot that same frame that was wide angle with a telephoto. Then I'm able to get that 100 megapixel with 20 100 megapixel shots stitched together, and thus you can get like a shot like that Lagos picture. So that again is just in the last 5 years that I've been able to think that way.
Maybe my last geeky question, although I make no promises. There's a scene at the Carrara marble quarry in Italy where they dig the finest marble in the world, and it starts where the camera is fairly tightly focused on a heavy tractor or a heavy loading equipment, and then it pulls back and back and back and back until you see the whole side of the mountain. Was that done with drones? Or?
Correct.
Yeah.
So that was like probably we tried. Well, I was working with Mike on that one, Mike Reed, and and the camera goes up to the machine and then pulls away. And first we had to get the right light, and it was tricky. It was really sunny at that time, so we had to wait for that kind of full overcast. And then there was probably like 10 attempts, and that's shot with a red camera, 5K red, and then again trying to do it and to do the even pull away. So again, that's possible because you can't get that intimate with a helicopter. It's just too big, and it just dust would be flying. But that small drone allows you that kind of very creative and intimate kind of ways in which you can begin a shot and then pull away into the big wide shot. So it's really exciting to work with these new tools.
So it's like the crane shot that Steven Spielberg loves so much in his movies, except the crane is kilometers long, potentially.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, pretty much.
Now let's go back to Lagos, Nigeria. What were you taking pictures of?
Well, Lagos attracted me because, again, if you look at the whole arc of my work, and one of the things that underlines all the choices that I've made over time is like, let's say I say I want to photograph copper mines. So there's thousands of copper mines around the world. Which copper mine? So to keep a narrow focus, I said, well, what's the largest copper mine in scale and in product and what's been going, a mine that's been working for a long time, because then it would have a greater void, a greater open pit. So I'd look at all those things as my criteria, because I wanted to get into places where you're seeing something that is extraordinary. So that's always been kind of one of my research go-tos. Lagos was interesting because it's in Africa and almost in the world. It's one of the fastest growing cities. They're adding about 6,000 people on a daily basis coming to the city, and literally just locking onto the edges of the city and building these ad hoc informal communities with roadways and everything as people are coming. And currently, they don't even know how many, but it's somewhere between 20 and 25 million people. Some think that's 23 million. It's the closest they can come to. But at current growth rates, by 2050, they're expecting 50 million people. And unabated, and if everything business as usual, by 2100, they would be 85 million people. It would be the biggest city in the world, given what's happening and the way, and all the population growth is the next 2 generations in Africa. All other big countries like China, India, the West is actually in a downward slump and has been for a long time. But China's plateaued, India's plateaued, Indonesia's plateaued, but in the next 2 generations, we're expecting 2 to 3 more billion people coming and being born in Africa. So it is that migration to Lagos that to me was interesting, in the fact that here's a city without a city planning department. It just happens. And it's fascinating to go there and to look at you know, this kind of improbable massive city, and it is like they have, you know, gridlocks there that are legion, where it's taken them like 18 hours to get traffic moving again. So it is was a very fascinating place to look at and to photograph.
Okay. Also, I believe in Nairobi, Kenya, you visited a landfill. And again, the principle was, what's the biggest damn landfill I can find? And it's outside Nairobi. Piles of garbage, but largely plastic bags, 15 meters deep. And in among all of that landfill are thousands of people who are picking through it for buried treasure, essentially. And no one's hired them. They're essentially, I think they're called informal workers. What's going on in that landfill?
Precisely. Well, you're quite right that what they're doing is that stuff would be dumped, and you know, whether it's, you know, bottles or anything, and they have to sort the plastic, and they get paid by the kilo, and it's really just cents on the kilo. And all day long they're just, you know, combining, you know, the right kinds of plastic that can then be recycled into the system, and because plastic bags had no value, they just kept accumulating. So it's like, it's not just 15 meters high, it's correct, but it's 100 acres of 15 meters high. And there are people who, there's a documentary said, Children of Dandora. There are children, there are families that live on the plastic pile, and kids who have been born on the plastic bag pile and have known nothing but that as their life. That is their playground, which is kind of hard to conceive. But it's true, we were there and we saw where they were living, and you know, they had a little kitchen area and they had tents and little, you know, shacks that they live on top of plastic bags. So it was quite remarkable. And then also what was interesting is that about a year ago, much to the surprise of everybody, all of a sudden the Kenyan government said plastic bags are illegal, period. And within months, all the companies that sold plastic bags were shut down. They, you know, all their inventory had to be, you know, taken out, and now they're plastic bag free. So it's really interesting that they've gone down that non-plastic, you know, that one-time use problem of plastic is that it just accumulates, and there's, you know, the single-use stuff just ends up in landfill. There's nothing else you can do with it.
So walking down the street, coming out of a grocery store in Nairobi, there's no longer any plastic bags. But all of the billions of plastic bags that were used until that decision, they're still there in that landfill. Yeah. And that's kind of a metaphor for a lot of the conclusions that one reaches from watching this film or going to these exhibits. Well,
just to add to that, one of the things that the Anthropocene Working Group look at, and it's a term they call Techno Fossils. So all of our dumps, all of our kind of landfills, which will have all kinds of things in them, aluminum and like aluminum tin foil or plastic bags or, you know, old radios or any of this stuff, any alloy, anything that nature can't create itself, things that we kind of synthesize and persist within the strata that would go deep into the future, is they refer to as a techno fossil. So all these plastic bags, if a geologist 2 million years from now is chipping along and says, oh, look, I just found all this plastic, so I now know I'm in the Anthropocene. This is evidence of our moment, our time on the planet, when we expressed, you know, this material, plastic, into the landscape, and it's a persistent, and the number one technofossil that we produce is cement. That we, you know, the amount of cement that we've, you know, laid down onto the planet is by and large the largest singular technofossil.
There's a photo that is to some extent less dramatic than some of the others until you realize what it is. It's a sky shot of thousands of huge concrete, I don't know what, gadgets that together form a seawall around part of China. And that's interesting in itself. You realize the scale of it. This is many kilometers across of nothing but these huge concrete things each the side of a car. And then it says in the book that 60% of the coastline of China is now protected with these concrete seawalls. China's got a large coastline. What does that represent, that scale of human intervention?
Well, it represents one thing, that they're aware that the oceans are rising and they're trying to protect the coastline. That's the first thing that they're trying to do, and that's why they're spending all that money. They're called tetrapods, also dolosses, these interlocking, and somebody discovered by making this geometric form and lock it together that it will hold against a pounding sea and not fall apart.
So I see on Twitter all the time people saying, ha ha ha, the oceans aren't rising. This is Barack Obama lunacy. Somebody forgot to tell China that the oceans aren't rising.
And they're spending a lot of money in order to prepare for that. So adaptation is actually one of the things that I believe that China is really embracing in a big way, and they're building nuclear power stations. Their wind farms are huge. You know, we often go to Google Earth to see what they're doing, and up in the Gobi Desert in that region, the wind farms there are beyond the imagination in scale. Huge solar plants. So they are embracing nuclear, solar, and wind on a level that is incredible, and also, you know, they're now tooling up to create electric cars on a scale that again is huge, and they now literally own the battery business. So all batteries are now made in China as well. So they are tooling up for the world that's coming.
Okay. You also went to Germany to a coal mine near the Rhine River that is slowly eating the surrounding towns. Tell us about that.
Well, this was quite remarkable because I wasn't even aware of the scale of coal mining. So, if you recall, after the last nuclear action in Fukushima, that Merkel went and said, we're shutting down our 8 last nuclear power plants, which I'm not sure if it was the right decision or not, but she did it. But that meant a lot more pressure onto coal. And this was one of the largest coal operations in all of Germany. And quite frankly, I've never seen an open pit on that scale ever. From the top edges, it was 6 kilometers across, and it's a big V. And this big bucket, it's a rotary bucket, and it has 18, and it's moving soil at a level that is unimaginable. And they have to, again, move massive amounts of soil. It's like there's about 150 meters of soil before they get to the coal seam, and they have to move it. And it's like a 6 kilometer V with about several hundred meters at the bottom, which is the open coal seam. And as they're harvesting the coal, the whole thing is moving along this way. So if towns are in its way, they just flatten the town because it's in the way of this big V mine moving across, because the coal itself is maybe 15, 20 meters of coal. And once they harvest that, they have to keep going along. And I think in terms of the film, it's one of those zeniths in the film where all of a sudden, you're looking at this monster machine tearing down a church. And I think it's unsettling to see that this is something that's happening as a result of harvesting coal, mining for coal.
I always remind myself that your sort of primeval lens or conceptual lens for looking at this stuff is that of an artist. And a lot of this stuff, even these coal digging machines, is eerily beautiful. There was a brief shot in the trailer that we saw of one of these machines, and they're vast. They're way larger than any dinosaur that ever existed. These huge metal things peeking up through the clouds. And I wonder how you respond when you think, man, that's the shot that we're going to use. That is a glorious picture of this enormous town-eating machine.
Town-eating machine. Yeah, well, it is the biggest land-moving machine that humans have ever constructed. It's 100 meters high by 300 meters long. And actually, when it starts to move, you're standing beside it, the earth literally shakes. So this is, and it's built by Krupp in Germany. This particular mine had 18 of these machines. And that was one of the reasons we went there, because it was like, wow, this is the largest machine, land machine ever built. And then also, this is one of the largest coal mines. And it took us over a year and a half to get permission, because you might imagine that a coal mining company doesn't really want, photographers or filmmakers around. And we had to convince them otherwise, that we had a story to tell about scale and this machine, and we wanted to bring it forward. And quite frankly, Germany, has probably, as one of the Western countries, done the most to green in terms of solar and wind, their power base. But unfortunately, this lignite, dirty brown coal is there, and it is one of the nastier coals you can burn. And I guess until time comes, the next, I think they're even at the coal mine, they're saying we see ourselves kind of over in a decade or so, that the pressure and the liabilities for carbon emissions are going to get so high that alternatives are on the horizon.
I was going to ask about that. A lot of the events that you photograph are time sensitive. There's something that happens on a specific date, and they happen in some of the few remaining really remote locations on Earth. How much of your time is spent making sure that you'll be able to get your shot once you're there? And how do you crunch some of those jurisdictional questions of public officials who really don't want gorgeous photos of what they're doing?
Well, and that's a great question. You never can be sure, but most of the work, the permissions have to really be signed off before we move a crew over there. Any one of these shoots, we're into tens and tens of thousands of dollars, because we're bringing film equipment in and special technicians who can run this equipment, and we have fixers on the ground there, vehicles, flights, all of those things involved in a shoot. So we can't, go there without having that permission pretty much in place. And that being said, things happen. Like when we went to Russia, to Norilsk, we were on a cultural visa, and they couldn't quite believe how on a cultural visa, we would come with 20 cases of equipment, with recording equipment, drones, film equipment. And they thought, well, you came in on the wrong visa. You should have come in on a journalist visa. And they said, no, it's a cultural visa, because we are artists, and I'm not writing for Maclean's or CBC or doing film. We're making a documentary, and I'm making a book, and we're having an exhibition. So we are indeed artists, and what we're doing is a cultural thing. It's not a journalistic thing. They had a hard time with that, and they kept detaining us. So we were detained like 4 times, fingerprinted, held back. And that would be really, really tough, because we'd come back and they would get us in the lobby of our hotel, and they'd come with us. And then we're at the immigration office or at the police station. And then it's like 4 or 5 hours. And that was what we'd normally recharge our batteries get ready for the next shoot, download all our cards, eat, get some rest, get ready for the 6 a.m. or 5 a.m. next morning wake up. And that would just throw us right off, and then we'd be working till 2 or 3 in the morning, and then getting 2 hours of sleep and going. So it was tough, but we persevered, we kept our cool, and managed to get what we needed.
Okay. I was about to ask, why did you want to be in Norilsk? What is Norilsk?
So the only larger deposit of nickel and precious metals that's larger than Sudbury is Norilsk, and it's been on my radar for over 20 years as one of the largest deposits of nickel and colored metals in the world, palladium, nickel, and copper, and it's a closed city. I mean, back in the day when there was a gulag and Stalin sent you off, that's where you went. You went to Norilsk or Murmansk. And it's northern Siberia. It's 350 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle. And most would go to their death, because it was a horrific place to work. Dark for 9 months or 8 to 9 months out of the year. Super freezing cold. We were there on actually one of the nicest days I think that happens in Norilsk. Sunny and shiny, and it wasn't really what we're looking for. I was actually looking for a moodier landscape, but you take what you get. But it was, quite something to be there. And there's like 200,000 people that live there year round. It's a closed city, even to citizens of Russia. You have to apply, or you have to have somebody sponsor you there to go to Norilsk. And the reason why they were suspicious of us when we landed is that if you Google top 10 most polluted cities in the world, Norilsk is usually number 1 or 2. And so the only reason anybody comes with camera gear is to tell that story. So they're pretty much, you've got this big kind of X on your forehead saying you're here for one reason only, because you're not here to tell a happy story about how great Norilsk is. So we had to work against that kind of perception.
And this town of 100-odd thousand people produces 1% of all of the sulfur dioxide, I believe, that's produced in the world. I mean, it's really not clean. And the thing that I found fascinating is there are still people living their lives, right? Like there are teenagers sort of flirting and goofing around on the riverfront, and except the river is this sort of multicolored sludge that's kind of bumping along.
Don't jump in.
It's I don't know, poignant to watch that.
Well, life does go on. I mean, I can't imagine what winter's like because it's so cold and dark for that long. But vodka's cheap. You go in the stores and like for about in terms of Canadian dollars, for $4 you get a 26er, and it's just like half the grocery store is different varieties of vodka. So I think a lot of that gets consumed in the winter. And
you were there during a kind of an employees festival, a workers festival.
Yeah, the metallurgy festival.
The metallurgy festival. Don't miss it. And it's even 20 years after, 25 years after the collapse of the USSR, the ceremonial vocabulary of the metallurgy festival still seems pretty heavily drawn from Stalinism. We are happy because we work for the best mine and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's very propaganda-ish. Yeah.
I guess the big question is, what are you trying to say with this tour of the world's most spectacular human interventions?
Well, on this particular, and I think my work from like early 80s, I really, like Inca was the first mine I photographed of scale. I did some other smaller things, but that was the first big mine I did. And it really set me on a trajectory of looking at human systems or large-scale human systems on the landscape. So I stopped being a landscape photographer because I loved going out there with my large format camera, kind of Edward Weston, Ansel Adams-ish, and taking, just really thinking about the image and slowing myself down and kind of attenuating into that space and finding where the image is. And I love that kind of meditative way of working, and that the large format slows you down. It's kind of like slow photography. But then I realized that just looking at the landscape, as much as I loved it, I felt that somehow it was nostalgic. It was yearning for a time that's passed. And when I started looking at mines and photographing them, I started to feel that, well, this is more in keeping with my times. If I'm going to be an artist working with a contemporary subject matter, then I need to stop just looking at I know it's there, that pristine landscape is there, and thank goodness it's still there. But I think it's going to be a much more powerful way to turn my lens to human systems, the largest things I can find that we've done to the planet to provide for our daily lives. So the idea is that this is not a disaster aesthetic. This isn't like Katrina and the flattened, suburbs in New Orleans, and photographing that, because that one might say that's a human-induced storm. But you can't make the direct correlation. But I was looking more for business as usual. These are the landscapes that are a direct correlation to our cities. We can't be here sitting on these chairs, or that glass comes from silica out there from a silica mine somewhere. Wooden floors come from forests, but we just don't see that anymore. We're totally kind of detached, and so through the camera and through photography and lens-based mediums, film, and now VR and AR, and of course the stills, I can reconnect us with those landscapes, and to be able to tell that story that, all those ages, the Stone Age and the Iron Age and the Copper Age and the Bronze Age, they're all alive and well. on a scale that is mind-boggling. And we're always casting forward. We're looking at the biological age or the information age, the computer, whatever, whichever way you want to slice the future. We're going the AI age we're entering in. But those ones are the ones that can come back and get us. And those are the ones that are dangerous because they're undermining the fabric of all the life systems that are there that we can sit here and take for granted. But we don't know what happens when we lose, the big, animals. We don't know what happens when the sharks are gone. We don't fully understand what happens when all the coral disappears. So we're playing with these things, not fully understanding the impacts, but it is an ever-growing appetite out there. So through the lens and through the medium of photography, I'm trying to reconnect us, not in an accusatory way, but in a revelatory way.
It brings you onto inherently political ground, though. Is that something that you embrace? Is that something that you're wary of?
Well, I've always been careful not to position myself as an environmentalist in the classic sense of the word. I haven't taken environmental programs. But I do position myself as an advocate for sustainability and the concern for a concerned citizen, a concerned artist for the planet, a concerned photographer. So I do see that as one of the things that I address in my work, and I do speak about the fact that, again, the scale, like the amount of wasteland, because what I'm looking for the largest mines or the largest, deforestation areas or the largest factories in the world, you see, all of a sudden you begin to see that scale firsthand. And whatever I'm showing you is just the baby toe on the foot of the elephant. I mean, there's just so much more. I can only bring you certain things in one frame that one might even gasp and go, holy cow, look at that. But that's a section of something that's way larger and way greater than that. So, I often said the things that I photograph, if you look at all the things I see in life every day and every moment, what I make a photograph is a tiny fraction of 1% of what I see is actually what ends up being my photographs. I think my way into pictures and spend sometimes years thinking my way into a picture, and then I make it. So it's very, what I'm doing now is a much more planned approach to my work versus in the early days, in the early 80s, I got in my car and drove around and had a mineral map saying, oh, there's copper in those hills, and I'll just drive around. Is there a copper mine around here? And try and find one that way. But now, I'm much more strategic and targeted at what I do. And
it's a much more collaborative work than it used to be. You've got your two longtime collaborators, Burtynsky and Beiswal, and staff of, I think it probably shrinks and grows, but dozens of people. Is it hard to be an artist when there are so many planning meetings involved?
I think 30 years ago it would have been hard. I think because these things kind of incrementally grow, and one thing I've learned to do is to kind of shut out the world and just turn everything off and just put the blinders on and where do I need to go? What do I need to do? And then, get everybody on side with where I need to go and what I need to do. And I've worked with the same crew for many, many years, and they almost can instinctually know where I'm going and be there with all the things that I need. So I don't think it would have been that, I think it was really important that I had those years where it was just me, my car, and my camera, and my thoughts, and where to go and what to do. And in 1983, which was a big transitional year for me, I had gotten a Canada Council B grant, which at the time was like $20,000. So if you go back to 83, I mean, it was 40 cents a gallon of gas, and I think $12 or $15 for a motel room. So it was that was a lot of money in those days, and it gave me a chance to spend 4 months on the road looking at mines, and I did the rail cut series at that time as well. And just really thinking about how do I take this idea and turn it into a life's work. And it was on that 83 trip that I thought, this is a big enough idea that I can spend the rest of my life, because I looked at the population charts and what was happening and what they were expecting was going to happen to human population. And I recognized we were in this acceleration of population, and us being the dominant predator species on the planet, and all of a sudden our populations are moving to billions and billions. And so actually when I was born in 1955, there's like 2.5 billion people, and we're almost 8 now, so it's almost a billion a decade. And and so I recognized that as I would be doing this work, these mines would be getting bigger, and the factories would be getting bigger, and and all of this stuff would be getting scarcer, because as we're consuming it and as we're depleting it, it's getting harder to find in more remote places. So I already envisioned that following this path would and sticking to the path would create a compendium of images that in aggregate would be far more than any one of them. So now I have almost 40 years of just thinking about our human footprint and the places where I can photograph that. And so I think it's proven to be, I think, an interesting idea to pursue. And now I think as we're recognizing that we're having a significant impact on the planet, I think people are also recognizing the work has been kind of teasing at that idea for 40 years.
How does your work fit in with other art? When you go to the National Gallery and see, your stuff next to the Sobe art competition, or next to the group of 7, does it feel like it's at home in places like that?
Well, I've always made the art. I've made the work to exist on walls, and so even in books or online or everything, they're kind of like a surrogate experience to the image on the wall. And I kind of fell in love, going through university. I fell in love with some of the modernist ideas that I didn't want to give up, which is the fine print, and the photograph had this capacity to resolve detail. It was the ultimate realist tool, and I didn't want to walk away from that strength of photography. That I believed it still was one of the pillars of the medium. That the realist painters, when photography came out, all of a sudden realized that, hey, this thing does a way better job of capturing reality than us sitting there, and painting every pearl and making paint look like felt. This thing did it just in a fraction of a second. So they all went off and did, and I think the Impressionist period occurred because they wanted to break away from realism. They had to find somewhere else to go. But photography did take over that realist role. And so I wanted to make work that again functioned as art, and because it is, it isn't defining something. The meaning for it is a floating point. So you can, one day you can read it for the color and the texture and the structure of the composition. Another day you can read it for what we're doing to the planet, and this is where our materials come from, or this is where our tires go to, and look at the structures that we built around that. So there are ways you can interpret it, and also like a quarry. If you're a quarryman, you'll read that quarry landscape very differently than if you're an art historian, or if you're just somebody who enjoys art and comes in and looks at it as well, or if you're an environmentalist, you'll see it differently as well. So I do accept that these things are like a Rorschach test. It's like an ink blot. And depending on where your position is, if you're an environmentalist, you're going to talk about the environment. But if you're, if you've studied abstract expressionism and contemporary art, you can talk about that as well when you look at the work. So I'm trying to layer it with, ideas from painting, ideas from photography of the past, and use those kinds of ideas and layer them into the work as well, so that you, and the idea is that when you come up to a photograph at one of these images, that you just can't walk by it very easily. You stop, because it stops you. It makes you say, what is this place? And how come I've never seen anything like this before? And to get a photograph in today's world, where we see tens of thousands of them a day, to get a photograph to slow you down and stop and look at it is not a small feat. I mean, but that sense of wonder, if you can invoke that and get people to think about it, and there is a narrative thread through all of it. It is how are we reshaping the planet? What is our, what are we doing to that planet, to the planet, to get the things that we need? And that is kind of every photograph for 40 years had on some level touched on that idea. So there's always this thread that goes through all of it.
This might be a good time to bring in our second clip of the evening. This is the elephant tusks burning, because it is really an inspirational part of the story. At the beginning of the movie, we see these piles of elephant tusks in Kenya, and then at the end of the movie, we see them burning. What's going on? Can you set up this clip? What's going on here?
So, it was really hard to somehow speak about the extinction events that are happening. A lot of them are imperceptible. You can't, if there's let's say some dead animal or a dead seal or some endangered species, you can photograph that, but or an albatross, they're endangered in the north now. But the story about what's happening and how do you tell that filmically and stills wise is very hard. So we spent a lot of time trying to find a moment where we can really talk about it. And when we heard that they were going to, that President Kenyatta decided, with some strong people around him, Winnie Kuru, and decided to burn all of the stockpile of these tusks over, I think it was, it was 8,000 elephant tusks, and with a value of about $150 million at that time. And they created these 11 pyres that they were going to burn. And we thought, well, isn't this an interesting way? And the depletion of elephants was happening at about a rate of about 12% per year, largely due to poaching and largely for ornaments, for bracelets or sculptures or whatever. And we thought, well, this is a kind of this isn't even a necessary extinction event. This is like us pursuing a material to make tchotchkes with. And we can't stop that. It seems like it's very hard to prevent that from happening. So this was a signal to the world that, and to poachers and to those who want to be in the trade, that at least Kenya is not going to stand for it any longer, and we're going to burn it so that these beautiful animals and their tusks don't get desecrated the second time by being turned into jewelry or sculptures. And then we thought, okay, well, so we spent the whole week there, the whole building of the piles, and every day we were out there with the workers, and it rained most of the time, and it was kind of miserable conditions. And it was for me one of the most emotionally, impactful moments of the whole shoot, in that when you start thinking about all of that, destruction of this beautiful animal and the scale of that destruction. I think one of the stats we heard was, because when a poacher goes in and sees a herd, they're going to go for the biggest tusk, which is the big male bull elephant that usually is the male of the herd, and they'll shoot him and cut off his tusks, and then they're called super tuskers, and you're also depleting the stock, because you're killing the most vital animals within those herds. And so so Kenyatta's pile, which we also turned into an augmented reality experience, was about 100 super tuskers of those big, long tusk. And they think there's maybe 25 or 30 of them left now in all of Africa. So,
Let's take a look at what happened to those elephant tusks.
We did the inventory, 3 months, to look at every piece of ivory, measure the weight, try and pair them every day. The smell of death. One of the tasks was written Amboseli elephant. I've had the privilege of working in Amboseli National Park for a long time. And I thought, this tusk represents an elephant I probably knew. This tusk will never hit the market. It will never make a trinket. It will never become a mantelpiece. I was not able to stop this elephant from dying, but I'm certainly able to stop it from being desecrated further.
Let's tell the people who that was. That's Winnie Carew,
Yes.
who leads a group called Stop Ivory. What's she about?
And she's friends with Richard Leakey as well, and they were the ones that did the first burn maybe 15 years ago, and she's a staunch advocate for the prevention and stopping of this elephant poaching. And powerful woman, and it was her driving force that actually made this burn happen. And in a good story, the CITES, were there as well, and they're the Commission on Endangered Species and stopping them from crossing borders, and they've managed to pretty much stop the trading of ivory, and they have it certainly written with China being one of the largest destinations. And Vietnam as well as a big destination. United States was a big, and so many are signing on to say no. Like if you have an ivory brooch or anything like that, do not wear it. You will have it confiscated at the border and maybe even fined. So they want to just stop any ivory from crossing borders, whether it's ivory from 50 years ago or 100 years ago. They just want to stop it altogether. And it's interesting. I learned that that Canada has not banned it yet, and it's, I think, largely due to the fact that the Inuit are still wanting to trade in the ivory from walrus and from the narwhal whale, and it's a challenge to kind of allow them to still work in their trade with those materials. And so we're in a kind of an awkward position right now as well, because we haven't banned it here in Canada.
Is that a mistake, or is that just a reflection of the cultural peculiarities that make Canada Canada?
Well, I think it's challenging when we have a First Nations that we try to impose something that may be that is part of their culture and has been for all time, for all their time here. So it's hard for us to impose on them the fact that they can't work on these and turn them into sculptures. Because they might even find a walrus that just died and take the tusks and turn it into something that they can turn into money. So we have particular, conditions here that make it challenging. I think we could go further to say, well, we just fine. We might say that's okay for them to have their craft and make their sculptures with theirs, but we don't allow any elephant ivory. And I think that we might be able to hive that off and still fight for the prevention and join the rest of the world to prevent any ivory coming in, like elephant ivory.
Near the end of the film, the narrator, who was the Swedish actor Alicia Vikander, begins to use the term a good Anthropocene. And after some of what we've seen, that seems almost oxymoronic. But what is a good Anthropocene, and how could we have one?
Well, I mean, if everybody starts to understand the scale of the problem, and we all start to pull in the same direction, and we start to use the economic tools and technology, and it's largely technology. So I believe technology, and most would believe that technology has gotten us into this problem. And I would say the steam engine then turning into the internal combustion engine is the single largest source of that problem. That technological innovation plus the discovery of abundant and cheap fuel called oil, bringing those two things together gave us the mechanical advantage of vast farming. So at one point, half of our population was engaged in the fields and farming, and the other half was in cities and doing all the other things. And today, it's like less than 2% of our populations are involved in farming, and 98% of us. And why? Because those big combines and tractors and machines are doing the work of hundreds and hundreds and thousands of workers. So and that's the internal combustion engine, of course, transportation to get it out there, and then ships and jets and planes and cars and all of that have all allowed us to expand. So I think that if you look at the core of the Great Acceleration, it is the automobile and it is the internal combustion engine that has done it. So so now if we can learn how to get around without burning fossil fuels, if we can find alternatives to burning again coal and oil and natural gas, the sooner we can do that, the better off we are, of course, because we're loading all of that into the atmosphere, and that is by far one of the greatest existential threats, short of all-out nuclear war, that we're facing today as a planet, and not just as any one country. It's like all of us. And so I think the positive Anthropocene is, again, if we all begin to pull in the right direction, and when individuals and corporations and governments, regional and city governments and regional governments and federal governments all, start to find ways to adopt the, at least try and meet the Paris Accord, goalposts and try to achieve those things and better them. That is, what we can do to try and stop the worst from happening. So we're going for a ride. It's a question of, if we don't stop, what we're doing, the ride will become, I think, terrifying. And there's a window, and even in the last IPCC report, that window is within 20 years, where we might get to a point where we can't reverse what we've done. That you get these positive feedback loops taking over, and like the melting of the permafrost and releasing all that methane, and then with all the ice caps and all the reflection of the white, disappearing, then it's a positive feedback loop, which then we have nothing in our toolkit to try and fix that problem.
My hour with you is up, and it ends well because you've just dumped an awful lot of homework on the plate of the people who work up the hill there.
And positive things that are happening, I believe.
Absolutely. I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank everyone for coming tonight, and as always, I want to thank our hosts at the National Arts Centre, our partners at CPAC, and our sponsors at the Canadian Bankers Association for making this possible. Thanks for coming out, everyone. We'll see you again soon. Thanks.